Welcome to Modern Psychedelics, where we explore the transformations made possible through intentional engagement with psychedelics. This podcast will help you integrate high consciousness living into the everyday and deepen the work ignited by altered states. You can expect balanced and grounded conversations around therapeutic, ceremonial, and recreational containers. My name is Lana Pribic, your host and guide. I am a 3-time certified professional life coach, and I work with people who want to integrate higher levels of consciousness into their daily lives so they can feel more peace, fulfillment, and connection. After all, our time here on Earth is so brief, so let's make sure we're really living. The song you hear is called Lost Horizon by Peace Sign. All right, let's journey. When working intentionally with plant medicines, having your own safe supply at a reasonable cost is so important. And it's much more accessible than you might think. And yes, I'm talking about everyone's favorite mind-bending mushrooms. I was so thrilled when I discovered Happy Mushrooms, a totally done-for-you grow kit that makes cultivating your own sacred medicine incredibly easy. Look, I've done the whole process with all the equipment before. I've ordered it all from Amazon, the syringes, the soil, all of it, and it's just not worth it. Happy Mushrooms means no spores, no expensive equipment, no lab setup. You don't even have to open the bag. Seriously, you just place the kit somewhere in your house with ambient light and good airflow and just let nature do its thing. And in 3 weeks, you'll be harvesting your own mushrooms, up to 56 grams or 2 full ounces. Guys, that's over a $500 value from a simple, discreet, ready-to-grow kit. Whether you're deepening your healing journey or simply want more sovereignty in your practice, this is such a powerful way to take your path into your own hands. There's nothing technical here, no touching, no spraying, no syringes, no stress, just patience rewarded with abundance. So if you're curious about growing your own supply, this is your sign. Visit happymushrooms.com to learn more and get started. And they were so kind to offer my listeners 15% off with the code LANA15. That's happymushrooms.com and LANA15 at checkout to get your stress-free, ready-to-grow mushroom kit. Happy growing and happy exploring. Hello, everyone. Happy springtime. I'm really excited to be sharing this episode with Paul Austin today. This is the second time that he's appearing on the podcast. The last time we had him on was June 2022. So today we're catching up. I actually just finished interviewing him. I'm feeling I'm on a high from a good interview. So I decided to just go ahead and record the intro for you guys right away. Honestly, this interview, we kind of went all over the place. We talked about a lot of psychedelic drugs. We talked a lot about our personal experiences. We drizzled in some of our own personal experiences into the conversation and really got to hear from Paul about microdosing. New depth to this microdosing conversation is kind of unlocked in our interview. And I had a lot of fun chatting with him about the application of microdosing, but also psychedelics for this population of people who are probably in my audience, because this is also the type of person I work with and appeal to, but the type of person who's really pursuing betterment of the well or optimization, right? It's the person whose cup is already half full. Paul gives us that metaphor in this interview. Once our cup is half full, a lot of us will just kind of settle there and say, well, it's good enough, it's fine. But how can we use microdosing, psychedelics, coaching, wellness practices, all of these things to fill our cup all of the way? And that's kind of what this conversation is about. So we talk about applications of psychedelics in business, in entrepreneurship, in creativity. Paul is really creative. He has created a lot of things in the last decade since launching Third Wave. And I really wanted to ask him about that. And I did. So we'll get some insight into his own creative process, his creative routines. Where does microdosing fit in? What else is he doing to safeguard his energy and his time so that he can continue to create and be of service in this world? So it was such a fun conversation. For those of you who don't know third wave, I mean, you've probably been under a rock because they are one of the, top three platforms in the world of psychedelics. They provide a lot of education on all of the medicines, on microdosing. They have tons of courses, programs, and more recently they launched their practitioner training program, which is kind of like a coaching program all about psychedelics to help you integrate psychedelics into coaching or whatever it is that you do in your work. So, to give you guys a sense of who Paul is and what he's all about, I'll just read his bio here. Paul F. Austin is reshaping the future of business by merging microdoses of psychedelics with personal and professional growth. As an entrepreneur and thought leader, he advocates for the power of psychedelics to foster creativity, clarity, and leadership. He has been featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and BBC's Work Life. Paul is a pioneer in the convergence of psychedelics, personal transformation, and professional success. And more recently, Paul has created the Practitioner Certification Program, a groundbreaking framework that reimagines how psychedelics can drive innovation in the boardroom and beyond. His approach challenges conventional leadership paradigms, equipping professionals to harness states of consciousness for sharper decision-making, emotional resilience, and breakthrough strategies. By merging the rigor of science with the boldness of uncharted territory, Paul invites a new wave of leaders to not just succeed, but to revolutionize how success is defined. What a bio. So yeah, for anyone who's listening and wants to really up their skills in psychedelics, and we talk about how psychedelics can be approached as a skill in this interview, check out the Practitioner Certification Program. Maybe it is the next move for you professionally if you want to either upgrade and up-level your skills and knowledge in psychedelics, or maybe you are just getting started in the space and need a footstool to come into it. So check that out. It's all linked for you below. And without further ado, please enjoy this really fun conversation between two psychedelic loving hippies who are also very professional and entrepreneurially minded. It's a fun one. I'll catch you on the other side with Paul. Paul Austin, welcome back. It's been 3 years since you last appeared on the show.
Well, I'm happy to be back, Lana. There's been a lot of changes in those last 3 years in the psychedelic space. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about some of those today. But I've been tracking and following the evolution of modern psychedelics and your work, and it's really good to be back and reconnecting with you. So thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel like, I'm such a little baby over here compared to like Third Wave and Psychedelics Today and Double Blind, the heavy hitter media outlets. But it's always lovely to connect with you guys. I wanted to just start with a little warm up of hearing your thoughts on actually San Diego, because I thought you just moved there, but you've been there for a while. But how's the psychedelic scene over there and the community there?
Yeah, so I live in a part of San Diego called La Costa. And La Costa is actually part of Carlsbad, but it's like a tucked away part of Carlsbad in some of the hills, close to Encinitas. And La Costa, I found, has this really high density of entrepreneurial, wellness sort of focused, psychedelic inclined individuals. And what I love about San Diego is cities have an energy in and of themselves, and I find the energy of San Diego to be very pure and crystalline. There's something about being in SoCal, where the weather's always nice here for the most part, and by the ocean and the water, but it's also drier, and so that lends itself to it's a really easy place to live. Like my nervous system in living here and being here feels very relaxed and calm, and wellness and health are really a center point for San Diego. And San Diego over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been the center point of where science meets spirituality. So you have a lot of cutting edge clinical institutions here, like the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. They're doing a lot of interesting clinical research on psychedelics, including for phantom limb pain, as well as a DMT fusion study. So there's some really interesting biotech research, cutting edge stuff that happens here. But you also have a very deep spiritual presence. So the Self-Realization Fellowship, which was started by Yogananda about 120 years ago, one of their main centers is here in Encinitas. You have people like Deepak Chopra, who he had his center here for a very long time, and they were exploring these other aspects around where science meets spirituality. And so I find this convergence to be, I think, the most integrated of all the places that I've traveled to and lived. And the vibe here is, like I grew up in the Midwest in Michigan, and I find the people here to be very kind and friendly, very warm, opening, welcoming. And so I've traveled and lived in many places over the last 13 years since I left Michigan. And I finally feel like I found my new home being here in San Diego.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like San Diego is an embodiment of who you are as a person in a way. So that's nice that you found that place for yourself. I find that a lot of people that I speak to, whether it's my clients or people in my audience, they really want to get involved with community and meet people, and they come back from retreats and they're on the pink cloud effect, and they want to just connect with people. What advice do you have for people who want to get out there in the community, meet people, make connections with others who are interested in this work?
Yeah, it's tricky because when we come back from these retreat experiences, we're very tender and raw and vulnerable. We've had these really deep and profound experiences for ourselves, but also oftentimes at these retreats, we really connect with other people who are at the experiences. And then we go back into our homes, into our bubbles. And for a lot of folks, it feels like the life they go back into is a very sort of rude awakening from the experience that they just had with psychedelics and plant medicine. And so being able to reach out and find, I think trust is so important in this process, because when we are raw and vulnerable and tender, and when we have our guards down, we may start to actively reach out and try to attend a conference or an event. Or a lot of cities now have local psychedelic societies, so they'll host events on a weekly basis where you can go and meet people and find the others. But I find the challenge is sometimes we come into those spaces with maybe a little too much vulnerability or not enough discernment. And so I've seen a lot of people get burned where maybe they're just too open. They go into this new community and they don't necessarily go into that community with the same level of discernment that they maybe have elsewhere in their life. So I think the first thing is, be intentional, look for those people, but also have some patience, because it does take time to really find the people that really resonate with you most. I've also found, and this is just an example in San Diego, but you have a few that would be also relevant in a place like Toronto, where there are these adjacent communities. So one that I feel like is very popular, or had been very popular in Toronto, was Othership, where there are people coming together
It's a cult.
for sauna and cold plunging and like that whole breath work and that whole thing. I go to a place locally here in Carlsbad called Breathe Degrees, which is similar. They do breath work, sauna, cold plunge, and so I meet some folks who also have my other adjacent interests in common. So, and a lot of these folks then are curious about psychedelics, so they're wondering about psychedelics, even though they're not quote unquote in the psychedelic community. So I think looking for some of these places that may be adjacent, that may have some of your shared interests in mind, and then getting a couple big events on your calendar. Like coming up this year, we have the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver, which is, I believe, June 16 to 20. And at the last one in 2023, there were 12,000 people at that event. I think this one will be smaller. My guess is probably closer to 5,000 to 6,000 because MDMA got rejected. So some of the hype has died off in the space. But getting a big event or two on your calendar and going and being willing to find the others is also really helpful. So discernment, continuing to practice discernment is always necessary, and looking for some of those psychedelic adjacent communities where folks are hanging out at.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, because you're right. People are like really vulnerable and open, and that is okay in that retreat space and in that ceremony space. But coming back to a big city or your town where the setting is not the same, yeah, that's a good thing to watch out for. So the last time we spoke, like I said, was 2022. 3 years ago. And you started Third Wave 10 years ago, which is so like, talk about pioneering. What's been happening at Third Wave in the last 3 years? And also what's new in microdosing? What updates do we need in microdosing?
It's a good question. So, Third Wave started as a hobby in 2015. I just, on a lark, started a website and then started to publish content about psychedelics and microdosing. In 2017, we rolled out a course on microdosing, like a self-study course that people could purchase. And then 2019, we raised a little bit of angel investment just to bring the website to the next level. We rolled out a directory of retreats and clinics and coaches and therapists, sort of practitioners and providers in the space. And Third Wave has sort of found this lane where it's like, we send out a newsletter once a week. I've continued to host the podcast, and I really love to host the podcast. So the podcast has been very prevalent and central. But we're not like a double blind. Where double blind is consistently publishing really long form journalism. Our main long form content is the podcast. And then we're getting more and more into video because I find, and I have been finding in the age of AI, video is going to become more and more popular. And so we've been focusing on how do we teach and educate more through video. So we've also, like I mentioned, we rolled out the directory. We maybe have 500 providers in that directory. So if folks are looking for a retreat center or a clinic or a therapist or coach to work with, we have quite a few of those in that directory. And then our big focus and emphasis has been on our training program. So 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, we rolled out what is now a 10-month certification program in what I call the skill of psychedelics. And the emphasis of that program is on we have an intensive, like a week-long intensive in Costa Rica for that. And then we really want people to become steeped in what we call the 5 key elements. So assessment, preparation, facilitation, integration, and microdosing. And that has been, I would say, the main both business but also energetic focus. We've had about 300 people who have gone through that training program, who we've brought on retreats. We've done now 8 retreats in Costa Rica as part of that training. And we weave microdosing into that. Microdosing is a pillar, absolutely. But there's also, people are interested in MDMA and ketamine and psilocybin and some of these other medicines that they can work with as well. So my background has always been more as a teacher, an educator, a facilitator. So I really feel a deep love for these trainings and intensives and retreats. So that's like happening. We've been impacted just like everyone else has in the psychedelic space over the last 6 months by the rejection of MDMA. So it has been, if I'm putting my CEO entrepreneur hat on, it's definitely been a tough last year in the space. We had this massive hype cycle from 2020 basically to 2023, 2024. That now has really come down. And so for a lot of companies in the space right now, there's consolidation, there's survival, there's how do we just keep the lights on and make sure things keep moving. And I forget the phrase that I'm trying to come up with, but we're also navigating some of those choppy waters right now. Yeah. And so a lot of it right now is looking at what are these greater opportunities that are starting to emerge. The vision for Third Wave has always been as a movement, right? Looking at it as this third wave of psychedelics, what are the various aspects, businesses, products, services, ways that we can help people that are part of this cultural integration of psychedelics. And one fun project that has been generating more momentum is the Microdosing Collective. And that's a 501c3 nonprofit in the state of Colorado. I started that with Ali Shaper and Josh Kappel. Ali is the co-founder and CEO of Supermush, which is a functional mushroom brand. And Josh started a legal firm called Vicente, and Josh was the campaign chair for Prop 122 in Colorado. So he helped to legalize psychedelics through the Natural Medicine Health Act. And that's been a really fun project because we started to have conversations with lawmakers around how do we get microdosing legalized? Because as you are very familiar with, and I'm sure much of your audience is familiar with, a lot of the regulatory structure around psychedelics, whether we're looking at the FDA approval pathways or in places like Colorado and Oregon, are very specific to high doses, therapeutic doses, where there are requirements of if you're going to do this work, you need to have a licensed facilitator who is present with you. They need to provide you with the medicine itself. You must be at a licensed service center to take that medicine. You must stay for at least, I think, 3 hours, regardless of the dose level. And so that's great. And I think it's necessary for therapeutic doses, for very high dose work. It's important that we have those safety measures in place. But as you and I know, Lana, if you're just microdosing, it's not tenable to pay $500 to take a single microdose, right? The way that the vast majority of people are microdosing is they're getting access to these substances. They may be growing their own mushrooms or just finding it through their community, or now there are a lot of places online that just openly sell microdoses, both in Canada and the United States. They get it to their home and they just microdose at home. And they don't need to pay $500 and go into a licensed service center and go through all of this rigmarole of the regulatory structure. So there's a gap right now, right? There's a gap because 4 million people microdosed with mushrooms in 2023 in the United States. 4 million people microdosed with mushrooms. 99% of those people did so illegally. Microdosing, my bet is that it becomes sort of, and continues to become, one of the most popular ways to work with psychedelics, because you start low, you go slow, you can sort of work your way up before jumping into the deep end. So we have millions of people who are microdosing, and it's still a Schedule I illegal substance, and in none of the legal regulatory structure is there a fitting way to actually do it. And the gap that leaves is in consumer protection, because there was a story that happened last year with this company called Diamond Shrooms, where
Yes.
they were, you probably saw this, they had chocolate bars and various smoke shops and head shops and other places like that. And it turns out it wasn't just mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms in those chocolate bars. There were things like amanita. There were things like psilocybin, which is synthetic psilocybin, 4-ACO-DMT. And so a lot of people, when they're taking these mushroom chocolates or taking these supplements, they don't know what's actually in it. And that is a massive risk. And so I think it's really important that from a microdosing lens, we create more structure so consumers are protected and people can access this legally. The challenge, of course, is, when you're talking to lawmakers, they're like, so you just want to legalize mushrooms so everyone can have access to them. And it's like, yes, and if you don't, then people will just do it illegally, because at this time the DEA does not give a flying fuck about mushrooms. They're so focused on fentanyl and cocaine and other sort of drugs that I would consider to be slightly more dangerous or associated with criminal activity. And so we really need to figure out, how do we fill that gap so people can microdose and they can microdose safely and effectively.
Yeah. Amazing. And how's that going?
It's slow. As an entrepreneur, I like to move fast. I'm not patient. I like to see impact and results. And our focus right now is on California, specific to the microdosing conversations. We had a little bit of impact in Oregon. So prior to engaging with Oregon, I think you had to wait 3 hours after a microdose. We've now gotten that time down to either 30 minutes or 1 hour. And we're trying to implement something similar in Colorado. So we've seen some small changes, but the big focus right now is on California. Because in 2023, the California legislature passed a bill to create a basically licensed service center model like Oregon and Colorado and decriminalize all psychedelics, but Gavin Newsom rejected it. 2024, they tried to pass another bill that did not have the decrim measure, that only had the regulatory license service center, but it got killed in committee because it was going to cost the state of California too much money to actually implement. And so now we're looking at, how do we work in a ballot initiative? And so just like how Colorado and Oregon legalized psychedelics by voting, we're wondering how we could do something similar in California. And ideally, that ballot initiative had language that would support the use of microdosing or at-home use for psychedelics. And we've already seen, there's a little bit of controversy around telemedicine and ketamine, like with Mind Bloom and Better You and Joyous, and there's a lot of companies now that are doing that. I am on the side of people, we should have optionality, we should make this more accessible. Telemedicine is the way of the future. So I do think the way it needs to get rolled out is probably similar to that, like a telemedicine model where someone will still have access to a prescribing individual, a practitioner who allows for them to get access to this. They would have the support that they need. They're not just on their own taking mushrooms whenever and however. But it's going to be another 3 to 5 years before we see any movement on that. And I think the other downside around the microdosing stuff is like a lot of the FDA approval pathway right now, whether it's LSD for generalized anxiety disorders, psilocybin for depression, MDMA for PTSD, almost all of the clinical research is focused on very high dose work because the outcomes are so substantial and significant. And so we won't even see the FDA approve like a microdosing medication, if you will, for I think it'll be maybe 4, 5, 6 years before that happens. So in the meantime, people are just going to have to keep getting their mushrooms from these sort of basically black market websites. And thankfully, there are some trustworthy ones. So even at Third Wave, we highlight those as a curator. There definitely are some trustworthy companies, but there's a lot of unsavory ones as well, which is
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll be tracking that closely to see how that goes. And the thing that really stands out to me about your work is that after all of these years, you seem to be just as passionate about microdosing as you were when you first discovered it. Whereas I feel like I know for myself and for a lot of people, they have this like period of obsession with microdosing and they go through it and then they kind of, they're like, hey, I'm good. I got what I needed out of it. So, yeah, can you speak to me a little bit about that and like what it is about microdosing that you love so much and maybe like even what your current practice with microdosing looks like?
yeah, it's a great reflection. You're one of the first people who's reflected it in that way. So I started doing acid 15 years ago, right? I was 19 when I started to do LSD. It wasn't mega doses, but it definitely wasn't microdoses, right? It was probably somewhere in the 1 to 2 tab range. And I just love LSD. Like it's just one of these things that it just works so well for my brain and my body and my psyche and my mood that when I started microdosing it 10 years ago, I take breaks. I'll go a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or maybe even 2 months without doing it. But I just find myself coming back to it like I would consistently take vitamin D because I need to make sure my vitamin D levels are higher. Like I need, I take creatine pretty often because there's great clinical research on the impact of creatine on brain health and mood and muscle and things like that. So I think of microdoses as like a nice little mood stabilizer. And they help me stay centered, stay focused. My preference has continued to be with LSD. I will microdose with psilocybin every now and then, but there's just more discomfort with psilocybin. Yeah. One thing I've been experimenting a bit more with is San Pedro. I do think San Pedro is like the redheaded stepchild with microdoses because so many people know about LSD and psilocybin, but San Pedro is a little bit more labor intensive to produce and create. But the sort of preliminary research on San Pedro is really exciting because it has the greatest impact on inflammation out of those three. And I think a lot of the efficacy of microdosing relates to inflammation and helping to lower chronic inflammation, both in the gut, but by way of the vagus nerve and serotonin also in the brain. And so I just see it as like a continual reminder of stay centered, stay present. It's great to take. I mean, I took acid yesterday. I probably did 15 micrograms yesterday. I'm experimenting with a 3 times a week process right now. And then I still do high dose work here and there, but I think the last time I sat with ayahuasca was 22 months ago. I did a dieta with the Shipibo. And so that was a 10-day container, 10 days of silence, 5 ceremonies. I dieted guayusa, which is like a plant of energy and openness and heart. But since then, I haven't really done any other intense deep dive work. Yeah, I mean, I feel called to Iboga Ibogaine. We were talking about this before we went live as maybe a next step. But when life is pretty good, and my life is decently good now, I feel centered and stable, and I love the work that I do, and I love the home that I'm in. I just don't feel the need to like rock my fucking socks every 3 to 6 months. Like when it's needed, and I can go back to it. But my medicine more and more has been meditation. I practice 30 minutes to an hour every day. I sat in a 10-day Vipassana at the end of 2023. And then I usually do 2 3-day retreats a year. Amazing. And that's been what I've been exploring more and focused on as an active practice in this space as well.
Amazing. I feel like that's the end goal for a lot of people who engage with psychedelics, whether we know it or not, is to do enough psychedelics so that we don't have to do any more psychedelics, right? Do you find like the microdosing practices have enhanced your meditation practice? Is that something you got into with microdosing, or how does that work together?
A little bit. When I did the Vipassana, The Vipassana is like no substances, right? No external substances. It's silence for 10 days. Did not take any substances. I was like, this is a great invitation to honor that container. I did fast the last 3 days, which you're not supposed to do, but their food was just so terrible that it was like disrupting my gut and I couldn't handle it anymore. So I just fasted the last few days. I've done a little bit of that, but honestly, it's just, in reflecting on this live, it's something I would be curious to explore more. Probably not, like microdosing would be interesting with it for sure, but more so in this mini dose to medi dose range, right? What would like 25 to 50 to 75 micrograms of LSD do to open up a space in meditation that allows you to deepen? That would be a great invitation. I would need to set aside an experimental time for that. I'm taking a week off at the end of this month, so maybe that would be a good opportunity to experiment a little bit with that. I do wish there was more around that. Not a lot of people talk about these protocols of how you could combine meditation with microdosing. But for example, I do a lot of contrast therapy, which is sauna, cold plunge, and I do low doses of LSD for that. And I notice I'm able to withstand the heat longer, or the cold doesn't get to me as quick. So I've definitely experimented a little bit in that way, but there's an opportunity to deepen into the meditation and microdosing overlap.
Yeah, I'm really interested in, okay, I'm not suggesting that anyone listening do this, but I'm actually really interested in like low dose 5-MeO for meditation enhancement. I'm someone who really struggles with meditation. Like it's so hard for me. And yeah, I've heard a lot about how 5-MeO in particular at a low dose could be useful for that. Yeah.
We did a great interview with Joelle Briere, who runs Tandava, and Rock Razam, who's Australian, but I think supports them on some of their retreats. I interviewed them maybe 2 years ago for our podcast about this in particular, because they were doing low dose 5-MeO with like a Vipassana style meditation.
Right. Yeah, I know about that.
And then we have a number of our practitioners who went through our training program who do very low dose 5-MeO with parts work with IFS, and see how as you go deeper into 5-MeO, and this is very low dose, right? So it's pen work, it's titrated, it's not bringing you up into this state of white light, bliss, unity consciousness. You're sort of like activating different levels. And that's interesting. And honestly, now that we're talking about it, maybe I'll just, and I don't encourage this or recommend it, but maybe I'll just get a 5-MeO pen and start to experiment with that.
Yes, not encouraging this. Don't do this, people.
That might be an interesting thing to experiment with. So thank you for the idea, Lana. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's something I'm wanting to bring into my life as well. And I actually just did a low dose 5 titrated experience, which was interesting. Yeah, it was not near the full dose, full release experience, but I could definitely see the application of it to just help you kind of release some energy and release some emotions without having to think through it so much. You know what I mean? To allow it just to like move through you somatically and give you that reset on a day-to-day level.
That's why I love the sauna too, like sauna cold plunge. Like I work out, lift weights maybe 3-4 times a week. I'm a type of guy who I need the sweat, I need the output, I need the movement, or else the anxiety just builds up. And so I think the reason I'm able to really sit and meditate is because I also do the really intense stuff that allows some sort of outlet.
Yeah, amazing. And related to microdosing, like microdosing plus leadership is kind of the niche you're carving, I would say. What would you say are some of those like qualities of leadership, those qualities that we want to embody as leaders that microdosing helps us to cultivate and unlock?
Yeah, there's 2 that I often come back to, which both have a biological basis in the brain. One is our often talked about friend, neuroplasticity, that the capacity for leaders to adapt and change and learn quickly and not hold on to old stories and not hold on to old patterns and not hold on to what was true yesterday because it's not necessarily true today or going forward. So that capacity to be adaptive, to be, I think, resilient is also part of this conversation. I find that when committing to a microdosing protocol, there is an enhanced ability to shift and change on the go. And I won't go too deep into the details as to why that is, but a lot of it has to do with the 5-HT2A receptor, the impact of psychedelics on serotonin in particular, but also the impact of, I think LSD in particular is so helpful because it's also quite dopaminergic. And so a lot of entrepreneurs these days are quite ADHD. And so I find that microdosing can help with maintaining that sense of focus, attention, and motivation. So you actually have something to drive towards as you're shifting, adapting, and changing in the present moment. So neuroplasticity and as a result of that, adaptability and resilience, I think that's one key thing. And then the second thing, and this is something that I hear some of the clients that I work with talk about in a more active way, which is courage. And there's been a fair amount of research that's been published about this relationship between psychedelics and the amygdala. It's very prevalent with something like MDMA, which is why MDMA is so effective for treating PTSD, because oftentimes when someone who has PTSD is attempting to recall that traumatic experience, the amygdala locks up and they just can't open it up. So the MDMA really helps to soften the amygdala. So these things that open up a lot of fear can actually be brought to the surface and processed. And at low doses, you don't see the same level of effect as something like a high dose of MDMA or psilocybin, but you see a smaller effect, and I think an effect that is more manageable to work with. And so in coaching sessions, a lot of great coaching is empowering the client that you're working with to make a leap, to take risks, to go into the unknown, to feel confident and safe in going into the unknown. And I find that this low dose work, microdoses or even mini doses, low dose works, when done either in a coaching session itself or part of a coaching protocol, what clients often come back to me and say is, wow, it really helped me to be more courageous. It helped me to make more difficult decisions. It helped me to do things that maybe I was afraid to do or I was procrastinating on before, or I just didn't feel like I had the capacity for. And I think that ability to be more courageous is so necessary in leadership, because half of the battle with great leaders is having the difficult but necessary conversations or doing the difficult but necessary things. And so if you have a tool that can help facilitate that process for you, I think it's a huge win for those in leadership roles. So neuroplasticity, courage, those are definitely what I've seen as the two most common benefits that leaders will experience with microdosing.
Yeah, courage is such a good one. That the connection you made to the amygdala, that's really good. And leaders, especially entrepreneurs and business owners, we have to take so many risks all the time. Like financial risks are just the start of it, but also it takes a lot of vulnerability to put yourself out there in different ways. So yeah. And also, as leaders, we have to be very creative, right? And we really have to stay connected to the energy of creativity and keep that flow going. And I find microdosing is something that we can really lean on to do that. Can you talk a little bit about that connection between creativity and microdosing, and whatever creativity means to you? We're not talking about art necessarily, just being creative.
Yeah, creativity is in some ways a skill that you can learn and cultivate. And just like psychedelics, it's more of a meta skill, because as we become more creative, we can learn to adapt and problem solve in a better way. And so I would say if neuroplasticity and courage are two pillars, creativity is probably connected into neuroplasticity, right? It's like when the brain becomes more plastic, when the brain becomes more malleable, then you as well become more malleable. You become more open. You become more willing to take chances. And so maybe it's even, as I'm talking about this out loud, it's like creativity is the middle point between neuroplasticity and courage, right? Because often to be creative takes courage, and it takes the willingness to learn and adapt, try some new things. And with microdosing or with low dosing, this is a lot of what we talk about in our training program as well for practitioners. It's like if you're going to work with or support a client through a process that is more creative focused, what is the appropriate dose level for that? Because a true microdose, meaning subperceptual, so let's say 5 to 10 micrograms of LSD, I find that does a better job of helping someone to focus And focus is a little bit of a different skill than creativity. Another way to look at it is convergent thinking, the ability to get things done and execute, is a little bit different than divergent thinking, which is taking a step back and asking, how are these beliefs or principles or ideas, how are they related? How can I see new connections in ways that I didn't see them before? And so I often find this mini dose or museum dose, when done on a walk or in nature or as part of a brainstorming session, is actually much more accretive to the creative process, because to be creative, you have to be able to step back, to get out of the weeds, to look at things from a new lens and a new perspective. And so I find this low dose work does a really good job of that. High doses, we're talking 3, 4, 5 grams of mushrooms, are a little too high, because you're not really able to be quote unquote creative, or you can't really apply creativity so much. Instead, new ideas, new thoughts, new insights move through you, but you're a little bit too disoriented to know actually what to do with them, which is why we have integration, because a lot of integration is then whittling down those insights into the applied change for everyday life. So creativity is somewhere in that sweet spot. It's a skill we can cultivate, and I find so much of what makes for a great creative is someone who is willing to fail, willing to try, willing to experiment, willing to do a lot of things, understanding that if they take 10 shots and just one of them succeeds, then that is often what the creative lens is. You can't be perfect. Creativity has to be messy, I find. It's like with writing, you have a shitty first draft, right? You're always looking at, okay, how do I just get my thoughts down? And then the editing process is the refinement process, the focus process. But the creative process is just, how can I be messy and vulnerable and get things out?
Yeah. And speaking of books, you're writing a new book, I heard on a recent podcast.
Yes, I wrote a new book. I'm working on, I would say, now it's like the editing process.
Okay.
And it's really exploring the topic of exploration and how psychedelics facilitate the skill of exploration. So, like a lot of my work prior, it's not really focused on how are psychedelics helpful for PTSD, depression, addiction. There's been a million books that have been written on that. That is nothing new. I'm really looking at how can we utilize psychedelics as a skill to become more aware, to become better regulated, have a better regulated nervous system, to find our true motivation, to better relate to others, and to be more resilient and adaptable in the face of challenge. And so a lot of the book is then talking about how this skill of exploration, or the skill of willing to take risks, to explore what I call liminality, or the liminal space, that skill can be engendered by intentional psychedelic work. That when we work with psychedelics in a skillful way, it opens up these new vistas of thoughts, ideas, opportunities. It helps us to break through ruts, creative ruts, or relational ruts, or business ruts. And so the focus of the book, like if someone is interested in psychedelics, but they don't identify as having a clinical diagnosis that they think they could benefit from, this is like a roadmap and a reference guide to how they could still get the sort of most out of it, and how it can be a much more creative orientation, because that's a lot of what I focus on. Healing work is important. It's so important. These are incredible tools for mental health, but healing is just getting your glass half full, right? What I've always been curious about is how do we get that glass from half full to fully full, and what can psychedelics do to help us to step into that sort of most powerful, capable, creative version of ourselves.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you with that, as in that is I feel like the audience that I serve as well, and hence both of our focus is on coaching and the process of coaching, because I feel like therapy, gets your glass half full, and then coaching is the thing that will help you get it full.
And I think, just to speak to some of the challenge and difficulty in holding this frame in the psychedelic space, because the therapeutic lens has been so predominant, we live in a very sort of therapeuticized world now, where everything has to be about therapy, or everything has to be about healing. And if I'm just frank and direct, I think it's boring. And I think it misses so much of the beauty and so much of the profundity and so much of the potential of these medicines and substances that absolutely, like if you look at the indigenous use of ayahuasca as an example, right? It has been used mostly by the shamans, the curanderos. They drink the ayahuasca to be able to heal, right? Because they are the shamans, they are these doctors of these indigenous societies. But what's not often talked about is the fact that they also use ayahuasca to hunt. And they will drink ayahuasca before a night hunt because it gives them better vision so they can hunt at night in the Amazon. People don't talk about that in the West. They just talk about the healing of it. Or peyote as well. Peyote, we'll hear a lot about the roadman circles and that peyote was used as a way to heal, especially from the harms of colonialism and alcohol and like all of that trauma, which is true and necessary. And they don't talk about the Tarahumara, which are an indigenous peoples in the north of Mexico who were cataloged in Born to Run, which is a really great book about barefoot running, how they used peyote so they could run these ultra marathons through these high desert hills of Mexico. So I think that lends as well on these are not just tools for healing. They help with the soul sickness, but they're also these tools that can help us to explore the outer reaches of what it means to be human. That to me is just, it's exciting, it's dynamic. It's why I've still been so interested in microdosing after all these years, because it's an onion that never stops peeling. And that is a much more exciting onion to keep peeling than this trauma happened to me, or this is my relationship with my parents, or this is my relationship to my grandparents, or this is my relationship to my ancestral lineage. I find the navel gazing can be too much at times. And sometimes folks just need a kick in the ass and go, what are we going to create? What's the vision from here? Like, how do we get excited about what we want to bring into the world rather than what do we need to heal from or what's happened to us?
Yeah. Yes. I think this is where you and I definitely connect in our work, and it's very exciting. Did you know that your problems don't come from the situations or circumstances themselves? Your problems are likely coming from how you approach them. More specifically, your problems might be coming from the level of consciousness that you approach them with. It's pretty simple. Here's how it works. Anytime something happens to you, you can approach the situation from various levels of consciousness. You can come from a low level of consciousness that perpetuates the problem and keeps you stuck, drained, hopeless, and under stress. Or you can come from a high level of consciousness that helps you move forward because you can more easily tap into creative solutions and access your intuition. The good news is that at any given time, you can choose how you show up and therefore have a massive impact on how your life unfolds. The trick is to be aware of all of the options available to you, which most of us aren't. We're stuck in our default modes, which is why most of us feel stuck and unable to move forward. But that job that you hate, your codependent relationship, or the numbing anxiety of not knowing your purpose in life can be the exact thing that moves you forward and gives you clarity, as long as you're approaching it from a high level of consciousness. In my coaching program, I'll help you become hyper aware of your current approach and help you shift to higher levels of consciousness. By addressing those unconscious energy blockages keeping you stuck, we unlock flow, acceptance, peace, and joy in life. And this isn't woo-woo. I use a research-validated coaching method that's benefited thousands worldwide. So whether you're corporate or spiritual or both, this approach offers practical integration into daily life, and it happens to pair brilliantly with psychedelics. High consciousness living is achievable every day, not just during psychedelic experiences. Psychedelics illuminate the path, but it's our job to walk it every day. My coaching program will provide you with a grounded and operational way to integrate high consciousness into your daily life. I am currently onboarding new clients into my practice, so if you'd like to learn more about the program, visit modernpsychedelics.net/coaching. And if you're ready to do this work, go ahead and apply now and book a discovery call with me at modernpsychedelics.net/apply. I'll have both of those links in the show notes for you. All right, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, I mean, ayahuasca used in hunts. Also, iboga has been microdosed historically for hunts. Hana as well has been used for those purposes. These medicines are often also used to celebrate life and to bring the community together and to go through processes of initiation too. So yeah, it's a way that we kind of bring these medicines into our Western perspective and make it fit into our Western perspective and almost like strip away everything else that doesn't fit into that therapeutic model.
I think like the word that often comes up for me is industrialization. We have an industrial
Yeah.
model, right? We have a very reductionist model. It has to be contained. It has to be focused. We have to reduce variables. We have to reduce complexity.
We have to be able to study it in our scientific
Right.
model.
It's like the machine era, right? And look, I think it's so awesome that these alkaloids may get approved by the FDA, psilocybin, but also drugs like LSD and MDMA, may get approved by the FDA to treat these conditions. That's amazing. And to provide balance, this is why I've always looked at psychedelics from a historical context and lens. This is why I've always amplified, even the spiritual traditions of Greece and Rome and the ancient Vedics and the ancient Incans as well use San Pedro in this way to create coherence and vitality in the leaders, really. And I think that's just as helpful and necessary as providing medicine to everyone else. It needs to be a both and. It can't be an either or. And I think sometimes in the psychedelic space, there's too much of an emphasis on, well, we just need to make this available for those who are suffering most. I think absolutely we do. And we need to make this available in structured ways for those who are building the systems of tomorrow, because we want those systems of tomorrow to be influenced by the intelligence that is inherent in some of these ancient medicines.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. Yeah. And I imagine in the process of writing this book, and I mean, you create a lot of things. You're a very creative person. Yeah. What's your creative routine like? I guess like creative hygiene is a word that's coming to me right now. Like, what's that look like for you? I imagine microdosing is a part of it, but yeah, what is the life of Paul as a creative person who is always making new things? And one of the things I really love about listening to your interviews is how, yeah, you have a way of pulling different things together really powerfully, and that is a process of creativity. So yes, can you tell us a little bit about like what are those routines? How are you working with microdosing? How are you keeping those creative juices flowing?
The reflection is interesting to hear because I feel like I'm in this moment a little stagnant as a creator. Like there are sometimes these plateaus or ceilings that one hits, and partly that's because I'm getting caught in the weeds or stuck in the minutia of things. So I do have to be intentional about setting aside time. One of the things that I've been doing more and more is just saying no. Like I find that's one of the most powerful things we can do. So no to exploratory calls, no to calls that could just be done by email, no to other ideas or ventures that I just don't think are aligned necessarily with the vision of what I want to bring forward. So I think saying no has been a practice for me, and it's a practice that I'm getting better and better at, but that protects the space, the time that I need to not do much, because I think what is so key to creativity is the capacity to rest, to not be online, to be off a phone or a screen, and to just sit there and think and ideate and reflect. So one thing I always try to do is set aside an hour each morning where it's just an hour to journal, to write, to think through ideas and thoughts. That's one way. I'm the type of person who I love to be engaged in conversation with a thought partner, like a sparring partner. And might be my business partner. It could be an advisor. Usually the people who are also my friends are also advisors or folks that I collaborate or work with. So I love just talking through ideas and coming up with them. And yeah, so saying no. I think protecting one's time and energy is important. Setting aside intentional time in the morning to be able to dive in to different things. And then having conversations with people who are also creative where we can bounce ideas back and forth. And part of my work, even over the last 10 years, has been my creative vision really looks outwards. I'm always thinking about the future. And so part of what I've been focusing is how do I turn more of that energy inwards? So instead of just constantly coming up with new things, there's a sort of a process of stacking so that these creative ideas actually build on one another, because what I've learned is I don't have the same level of energy that I did 10 years ago necessarily. So I also need to be that synthesizer is what you were saying, right? So how do I synthesize these ideas? Often because I read a lot. I read at least a half hour every day. I try to read on weekends, maybe an hour. So a lot of the ideas that I get are from, I have sort of a broad range of what I read. So I think reading is also like my input for creative ideas. But yeah, that capacity to synthesize, that capacity to stack, that capacity to stay focused on the larger vision, but also be willing to take some of these side tangents and side roads, because that's where some of the most creative gold comes from. That would be a little bit of the context. That's a good question. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I actually want to dig a little deeper into it, if that's okay with you.
Please.
When you're doing the journaling, you're literally putting pen to paper kind of thing?
Yeah,
Yeah.
this. I'll show you. Like I have this.
Yeah. Okay. So you have one kind of notebook and you're just jotting things down as they come up. Because I have a friend, listeners will be familiar with him because he's been on before and co-hosted, Kev, who's very creative, and he literally carries a notebook around with him in his pocket and like writes things down. So there's something about the physical act of just like allowing it to be messy.
Totally. And if I was a better creator, I think I would do the same. And I'm just going to make a note for myself, because there's these great things called the field notes guides that fit perfectly in your pocket that I've had before. And I think that's something where it's like, I love to go out to a cafe, to a restaurant, just out and not bring my phone, and just have a little notebook or something like that. And then as you're undistracted, things start to filter through and come through, and be able to jot those down. Amazing. And have that ability. And then the way that microdosing fits into that, because I know that was also part of your question, is it amps it up a little bit. When you take a microdose, it's like lubricant for creative juices. So it lubricates things a little bit more. It's a little bit easier to start to come up in the creative process. It's a little bit easier to dive in, because part of the creative process, a big part of it, is just starting. And just starting to write things down, or just starting the artwork, or just starting whatever it is. So I find microdosing just really helps with that lubrication. And then will help me to stay deeper in flow for longer if I set up the right container for it.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. I would agree. And I would also add cannabis to the mix there, where cannabis for me helps me really get into that creative synthesizing things zone, so much so that I feel like it's actually become a bit of a crutch for me.
Totally.
But is
the
it part
risk
of
with it?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
I think
And it's
I track your social media.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it part of your practice as well?
It has been, but I got so addicted to it. I was smoking it almost every day for 5 years that 2 years ago I just had to be like, okay, I got to stop. So I stopped. But then I've had some restarts. I got back into it. I got off again. I got back into it. I've now been off of it for the most part for 8 or 9 months.
Okay. Wow.
And I smoked over New Year's a little bit, like twice, 2 or 3 times. But I haven't gotten back into it, because my thing with drugs, like cannabis, I've also gotten into it with kratom. Kava and kratom is a really interesting mix. I have a really hard time with moderation. So if I get into something, I'll do a lot of it. And so if I start smoking, if after this call I was like, I'm going to go get a joint, I'm going to roll a spliff, because spliffs are my favorite. They're like the fucking best. That's like the vice. But if I smoke one, then I'm like, this feels nice. So the next day I'll be like, I don't want to feel that way again. And I'll smoke another. And then before you know it, I've smoked weed every day for 2 weeks. And then my mood is off, and I'm depressed, and I have a hard time focusing, and I'm hard on myself. So I've just decided the occasional, maybe once every 4 or 5 months is fine. But outside of that, just better to not have.
Okay. Cool. I'm foreseeing my future as you're sharing that. Okay, one more question I have for you before we get into the coaching program, because I'm actually really excited to hear about the developments in that. The new kid on the microdosing block, Kana. Yeah, you guys have some cool resources on your website, but I'm really curious, while I have you here, to hear about how your community has been working with Kana, what your thoughts are, because it's not really a microdose, but it almost acts like a microdose, as the regular dose of Kana acts like a microdose. So yeah, just curious to hear some of your thoughts, because we're hearing a lot more of it. And as people know, I also just started bringing Kana to Canada. So yeah, tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's a heart opener. I think a lot of people are looking at it potentially instead of SSRIs, because it's also a mood stabilizer. It's subtle enough that it's not like smoking weed or drinking this kava kratom or taking LSD. So it's subtle enough that I don't find any sort of attachment or hook around it. So I can do it a little bit and I'll just notice my mood is getting a bit better and I feel a little lighter and a little bit more energized and focused. There's various ways that you can get it through gummies, through tincture. You can take the powder itself. There's someone who's even created a vape pen with Kana, which I love. I think it's the best. I've tried it more than a handful of times. So I would say I use it here and there. I know a lot of people who create microdoses with it with psilocybin. So they'll have a psilocybin Kana mix and the Kana will just be a nice little extra heart opener boost. For those who are very sensitive to medicine, Kana can be a little bit more intense. It can be a real big heart opener. I'm like average. I'm not overly blocked, but I'm not super, super sensitive. So I definitely notice it. And it's something I've worked with a little bit. And it's something we talk about on our website. We have a guide to Kana and we've amplified some products that way because it's fully legal and people enjoy it. It seems to be helping them.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. It's new kid on the block. It's cool to see people getting introduced to it, and lovely that it's a legal option.
Right.
So tell us about because the name of the coaching program has changed, right?
Yeah, I brought it out from under Third Wave, so now it's the Psychedelic Coaching Institute. Like it has its own name and brand.
Oh, okay. So it's no longer under Third Wave.
It's a fully new entity and
cool.
Because Third Wave is much more of a media brand, and so just from a way of keeping our books clean and keeping things organized, it's now like a sister brand to Third Wave.
Yeah. So how many cohorts have you guys brought through by now?
We are enrolling now for our 10th cohort, which is fun. I love these cohorts. It's an interesting mix of, we have some very established coaches who come in, right, who have been coaching for 15, 20, 25 years. And they've heard about psychedelics and they want to weave it into their practice. That's like one demographic that comes in. We also have another demographic of folks who are coaches. They've gone through a training or a certification, but they're still pretty new on their path. They've coached maybe for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and they want to be on the cutting edge. And so they're looking to incorporate psychedelics into their practice. And then we have quite a few people who are more like in career transition, and they've had a meaningful experience with psychedelics. And they see our training program and they're looking at it as like a career leap or career transition. And so what we tell folks is it's really heavy on the psychedelic. We've added in more and more things specific to coaching fundamentals because we've noticed a lot of people need those coaching fundamentals for them to feel confident to go out into the world to do it. But it's not a certification program for the skill of coaching itself. We're really, we want it to be as focused on psychedelics as possible. And then we're recording this mid-March. We have some kind of shifts and changes that are coming down the road. We're going to roll out, we've only had this one main course really, which is a 10-month certification program that includes the intensive in Costa Rica. And we're going to roll out a new course that's more of like an intro course that covers more of the coaching fundamentals, the business fundamentals, and microdosing in particular. And so we're excited to roll that out. But I would say usually people notice there's like two big benefits: confidence and community is what I found. They get the knowledge, the information, the know-how to be able to do this work in a way that feels safe and ethical. We really emphasize this is not a training program if you want to guide people through high doses of psychedelics. This is a training program that focuses on the preparation and the integration. And we cover microdosing and we talk about these fundamentals of facilitation, but we are not training you to be a high dose guide. I truly believe that a cohort style training program is not ideal to train guides in a really skillful way. I do think there needs to be a considerable amount of energy and time put into mentorship and apprenticeship if someone wants to be a guide for high doses. So confidence is the one in the community. We've now had 300 people who go through, and the community of people who have joined is just a really beautiful, intelligent, devoted group of humans. And so that's also been a really fun. We have now a lot of great people all over the States and even all over the world who are working with these medicines, some underground, some above ground. And it's been fun to see how the community continues just to grow and evolve and do this work in a really beautiful way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing because I think that's what people are really craving as they come into the psychedelic space is, that kind of leap into a next career. I work with a lot of clients who are looking for that. But then also, yeah, that community piece is something that's missing for a lot of people. So, if we can bring people together in a way that allows them to build confidence and skills and training, but also introduces them to people, that's a huge win. Are there like specific frameworks or methodologies that you're using, that you've developed, or that you're leaning on that you can share a little bit about?
So we have it split into three main sections, three main containers is what I call them: theory, intensive, and practicum. So the first 3 months is theory, and the intention of the theoretical section is to give people a sense of the water that they're swimming in. Right? This is the context of the third wave of psychedelics. This is some of the scientific research that we have on these compounds. These are the safety and ethical frameworks that we must be mindful of. These are some of the intentions that people have in coming in and how we support them in integration. This is the legal landscape. What is legal? What is not legal? So the first 3 months is really giving them a sense of, okay, this is the context that I exist within, emphasizing both the indigenous and ancient use of psychedelics, but also the cutting edge sort of science and modern use of psychedelics, right? How do we hold both of those as part of the larger ocean that we're swimming in? We then bring people to the 6-day intensive. We've structured that intentionally to be, you could say, a build-up or even a deepening, where we do a microdose, like a low-dose meditative nature walk experience, temescal, high-dose ceremony, and then a day for integration. And then we have like an arrival day and a kind of leaving day. So it's a 6-day intensive in total for the experience. And that really emphasizes the importance of walking the walk. That as practitioners and facilitators, we must go through our own transformational process, ideally in a group. I find the one-to-one work to be important, but there's a lot that we learn when we're going through this process in a group that would not otherwise show up in one-to-one work. This person is triggering to me, or this person reminds me of my parents, or there's just so much more work that gets to be done because psychedelics and life itself is about how we relate. And so being able to learn that skill of relationship in a safe container with psychedelics woven in is a huge part of it. And then the majority of the program from a time perspective is focused on the practicum. And so we cover what we call the 5 key elements: assessment, preparation, facilitation, integration, and microdosing. We spend about a month on each of those skills. And we provide workshops and lectures and give students an active chance to practice this hands-on in the laboratory environment with mentorship before they go out into the world and actually start to work with clients in this way. And so I think if a facilitator knows how to assess, prepare, knows the fundamentals of facilitation, knows how to support folks through integration and the role of microdosing in that process, they at least have the foundational knowledge not to be dangerous.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's really what we're going for. It's like the training is not for someone who wants to be the best of the best. I would say there are much more intentional trainings. I would even say mentorship or apprenticeship path. If you want to be the best of the best from a guide perspective, great. But if you just want to be really effective from a coaching perspective, and most importantly, know that what you're doing, you're reducing harm, you're helping to create safety, you're ideally also helping to make these results for clients much more effective, which many of our facilitators do. That's the end goal. Right? Okay. Is how do we get all of these people to a certain level where they can go out into the world and really be supportive of someone's path as they're moving through it.
Okay. So it sounds like a training that supports all types of practitioners, coaches, people who want to be guides, or is it specifically aimed at coaches?
Our framing is on coaching. I would say most of the people who come in are looking at this as a version of coaching. I would say the paradox or the irony or the challenge is that there's also, with psychedelic work, there's a lot of mentorship. There is a lot of teaching for some clients because they really don't know anything about psychedelics, right? So that teaching and mentorship angle is also important. There's usually some level of advising as part of it as well. So we teach some of these fundamentals of coaching about what psychedelics may open up on that coaching path. But there also may be these other skills that we need to bring into the container. And we have a lot of folks who come in from a coaching background, but we do have body workers, we have nurses, we have energy workers, we have other folks who are in career transition who are still trying to figure out what they want to do. And so a lot of this is the foundational fundamentals to make sure these folks can go out and support others. I would say it's really ideal for like people who are beginner to intermediate. This is not a training for folks who are like already quite advanced and want to deepen in that. I think a great training for that is this one. It's also controversial, so do your own research and diligence, but it's called ecstatic mysticism. Have you seen this training?
Ecstatic mysticism?
Yeah, it used to be called AWE, AWE.
Okay.
It's a three, this would be like up your alley for sure. It's a 3-year program. It includes 6 peak experiences, and like most of the faculty are indigenous elders and teachers.
Wow. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I can't imagine signing up for 6 peak experiences.
Burning Man, Iboga, Ayahuasca, Peyote, Dark Room. Maybe one that's
Wow.
around breath.
Burning
or
Man
breath
is part of
work.
the curriculum?
It's one of the. It's one of them that you can choose, right? You
amazing.
can have various options that you can choose for that experience. Yeah,
Very cool. Very cool.
yeah, it's super interesting.
I'm going to have to look into that. I actually have this question on my mind since we started recording. The skill of psychedelics.
Yeah.
The skill of psychedelics, because that's kind of what this whole program is built upon. What is the skill of psychedelics? Why are we viewing it as a skill? How do we develop it?
So the skill is a more masculine frame, right? It is this sense of something we can cultivate and develop. It goes back to what we were talking about before, where most of the emphasis has been on the feminine and the healing side. And so really what we're bringing people into is how can you be in relationship with an ally, an intelligence, and work with it skillfully in a way that helps to create at the core, right? Helps to manifest, helps to bring things into reality. Fundamentally, the way that I would look at that, the way that I teach it, the way that we teach it in the training program is a lot of the skill of psychedelics. What's the appropriate dosage? What's the appropriate medicine? And what's the appropriate frequency, right? And then what are the supporting modalities that help the individual to integrate those lens, those insights, those profound ways of knowing into their body, into their psyche, into their being. And so what I found is as we become more skillful at working with psychedelics, there is a capacity to bring more into reality, to manifest more, because we're more productive, or we can spend more time in flow. We're more clear or more aligned in terms of what we want to bring through. We are able to better clean out the garbage disposal, if you will, do the necessary shadow work and get out of our own way in a much easier way. So the skill of psychedelics is how we work with these medicines and these allies, or how we support clients in working with these medicine and these allies. So it's safe, it's effective, it's useful. And there's various analogies that we use within that. One of them is the lotus flower analogy. Are you familiar with the lotus flower analogy, Lana?
No, but I can imagine what it might be. Go ahead, share it.
So the lotus flower is like the symbol of enlightenment in Buddhism. And it grows out of mud, right? The lotus flower grows out of mud. So first we must make sure that the mud or the soil is clean and it's healthy. So that's the shadow work, right? Tilling the soil is the shadow work. And usually the best medicines for that are MDMA, ketamine, or maybe low doses of psilocybin, right? So first we have to till the soil, do the shadow work. Once we have soil that's healthy, then we plant that new seed. And planting that new seed is planting that new seed of self, ego dissolution, right? So high doses of psilocybin, high doses of LSD. You could also make the case in the argument for high doses of ketamine are a great way to plant that new seed of self. Then once that new seed has been planted, then you must water that seed. You must give it sunlight. You must give it nutrients. That's the integration process. So to continue to help that lotus flower grow, and then once it's ready to grow and open up, that's when substances like ayahuasca, iboga, 5-MeO help for that full flower, that full opening towards enlightenment.
Wow.
Because if you go right for the enlightenment, as you've experienced, not personally maybe, but maybe with clients or as you've heard stories of, if you go right for enlightenment and get blown out, it's very destabilizing. So
Interesting.
you need that new foundation of self until you get into this very high dose work that allows you to really open up into this enlightened sense of self.
Interesting.
So that's like one analogy we use.
I would actually toss iboga into that first phase of doing the shadow work, because it can get pretty shadowy with iboga, because it really takes you to the root, into yourself.
And I'm
So it's
glad you
like,
brought that up, right? Because that is part of the skill of psychedelics then, because depending on the client that you're working with, I would say that should totally be the case if someone has a TBI or
yeah,
if someone maybe has an addiction problem. Assuming they have a good heart, right? Then Iboga might be a really good first step for them because it's going to address some of those core things.
yeah,
But whereas if someone has PTSD, I might say actually MDMA might be a better option. Or maybe they have a really difficult relationship with their spouse or partner, and that's their intention in coming to psychedelic medicine. So we might say, okay, maybe start with MDMA then, that path and
yeah.
process as well. So yeah,
I feel like Iboga's so full spectrum that I feel like it could be of assistance in all the phases. Have you ever heard the analogy by Tricia Eastman that Iboga is like the root of the tree and 5-MeO is the star at the top?
No.
Have you ever? Yeah,
It's a great one.
It's an interesting.
I had her on the
yeah.
podcast. Trisha's a friend. I'll have to. Does she talk about this somewhere, or is it in her book?
She talked
maybe?
about it on a podcast. Maybe it was your podcast back in the day. Maybe it was Psychedelics Today, but it was an interview with her and her partner. And yeah, they
Joseph.
talk about that. And it was after my Iboga experience that I was like, ooh, 5-MeO, what's the star at the top? But that reminded me of your lotus analogy.
Well,
really cool.
and I'm glad you brought that up because Martin Polanco, who's a good friend of mine here in San Diego, a medical doctor, he's been doing work with Ibogaine for 20 years. He works now with a lot of Navy SEALs and ex-NFL players, and he does that combination. He does Ibogaine with
Yes.
5.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a lot to be said about that too, about like Steve Rio is a good person to tune into about that combo. I think him and I both are of the belief that it's good to space it out, to give
Right.
some space for Iboga. But they seem to be creating some good results over there at
Totally. And I think the trade-off to that is I've also had friends who have only done Iboga or only done Ibogaine, and they become really dark and suicidal for some time.
yeah.
So I think that's why
Well,
they
that's
implemented
the-
the 5-MeO at the end, because they noticed that a lot of people who were
Right.
only doing Ibogaine or Iboga were like stuck in
Yeah.
a dark place and couldn't quite.
I wonder how much of that is also like how much of that could be helped through prep and like doing some of that shadow work before. Maybe it's like it's just too much when it comes on during the medicine. But yeah, okay, we could jam for days, obviously. I was listening to your interview on Psychedelics Today, and you had this awesome quote that I pulled. And then my last question before I let you go and get back to your day. Okay, you said, life is malleable. I can make of it what I want. I just have to be clear about what I want. And if I'm clear about what I want, then I think I have the capacity to bring that into existence. Love that. So off of that, I want to know what you're wanting to create for yourself and for Third Wave. What are you calling in? What are you wanting to create?
It's a very high level. I would love to be part of a creation which allows any adult who wishes to use psychedelics to use them in a way that's safe, legal, and effective. So that is the big vision of Third Wave, is how do we create a cultural framework for the safe, legal, and effective use of psychedelics, right? That's really what I want to move through. I think that's number one. I think, number two is I would really love to be a supporting force in helping business to become more sacred. I think that's another big aspect. I think business, for good reason, has this reputation of profanity, of destruction, of extraction, that it's a force for evil, not necessarily good. And I also believe that business is the greatest force that we have alive to us in this day and age. And so I would love to play a role in helping leaders to become more conscious, to become more aware, to focus more on regenerative outcomes, to focus more on how we create harmony. So I think on a very personal level, I'm really motivated and inspired by that. And then I think even beyond psychedelics, right, and leadership, the larger vision of where I see those two converging, legal psychedelics and more conscious leaders, is I'd love a world in which we live in greater harmony with our natural environment, right? We don't feel as if it's such a us versus them mentality, that we're able to find a greater place of integration and harmony, and that we can, in a way, remember or retrieve how it is that we've lived as humans for thousands of years, which is not in concrete boxes necessarily, right? In concrete cities, in concrete walls, in places that are very, right? There's this machine-like quality to our language, our words. I'm going to download things, my hardware, my software, right? All the language and words that we use. Yeah, my program, right? It's like we're very techie, and I love my greater sort of vision or hope is that we can be deindustrialized as a culture and community and come back to our true roots as human beings, that we allow AI and artificial intelligence to really handle that side of life so we can, find our more primitive isn't the right word, our more wild side once again as human beings. And that's what I'm really driven and motivated by in my own work first, because everything I think starts with my own work, but it's what I'd love to bring more and more to the world at large as well. The rewilding, I think that's the buzzword for it.
The call of the wild. Yeah.
Call of the wild.
Amazing. Yeah. Oh, well, this was so fun. Thanks for dropping in. When does the next cohort start of the practitioner certification program?
We have cohorts that start every few months. So I would encourage folks to go to thethirdwave.co. If you want to go directly to the website, it's Psychedelic Coaching Institute, but that's a little bit more to remember. So thethirdwave.co, or just type in Third Wave Psychedelics, the Third Wave Microdosing. And we have, on Third Wave, we have our guides, we have our podcast, but we also have details on that practitioner training program. So I'd encourage folks to go check that out. And then if folks want to follow me on social, I'm on Instagram and Twitter, or X, I guess it's what it's now called, as well as LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on those three platforms. So I'd encourage anyone who's listening to this to say hi, send me a note. And if there's anything that we or I can support you on, just let us know.
Amazing. Yeah, we will have all those links that you mentioned in the show notes for ease of access for people. Amazing. Well, yeah, thank you again so much. And any last words for the people? No pressure.
I just love acid. I think that's what I'll end with. LSD is my favorite. I think it always will be my favorite. And I think it's still unfortunately quite stigmatized because people don't know how to work with it in a super skillful way. But it's so pure. Like, it's just this pure crystal of love. That's the energy that I get from it. And it's just my favorite. So that's how I'll end.
I love that. That's your last word. Well, Bicycle Day is coming up. Do you have any plans to celebrate?
I'm speaking at an event, but
okay.
It's not really psychedelic or Bicycle Day related. It's in Austin, but I love Bicycle Day. I've participated a few times, and it's always a blast.
Okay. Amazing. Yeah, I think my friends and I are going to do the bike ride on acid thing this year.
There you go. Love it.
So fun. Amazing. Well, thanks for listening, everyone, and check out all the links down below.
Thank you, Lana.
Thank you so much for listening to and supporting the show. To stay in touch, sign up for my mailing list, which can be found in the show notes or on modernpsychedelics.net. If this episode sparked something within, please let me know by leaving a review of the Modern Psychedelics podcast on Apple and Spotify. This really helps to share these messages with those who need them, which is the whole reason why I do what I do. And if you haven't already, come join the ongoing conversation over on Instagram with other beautiful souls. We have an incredible and conscious community over at the handle Modern Psychedelics. And don't forget that the work begins after you come back down to earth. And I'm standing shoulder to shoulder, doing it with you.